let's turn to the brewing tensions in the Gulf. Iran has seized a British oil tanker while there is an Iranian tanker detained by the UK. Meanwhile, under the pressure of economic sanctions and increasing military presence of the U.S., Tehran announced it had broken up an alleged CIA spy ring. Before we get down to a discussion about the latest related to the Iran issue, take a look at this first.
A series of incidents in the Gulf with relations between Iran and the UK quickly deteriorating. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard seized the British flag Stena Impero oil tanker in the Strait of Hormuz last Friday. Iran released footage showing part of the 23-man crew it's currently detaining, along with the tanker in the port of Bandar Abbas. The UK described it as a hostile act, while Tehran said it detained the vessel after it broke international maritime rules and collided with a fishing boat.
Iran does not seek confrontation. Iran wants to have normal relations based on mutual respect. But international agreements must be implemented multilaterally, not unilaterally.
The seizure came just 2 weeks after Britain seized an Iranian tanker off the coast of Gibraltar, suspecting it of carrying oil to Syria, which is in violation of EU sanctions. On Monday, Britain's outgoing Prime Minister Theresa May chaired an emergency response committee meeting to discuss the crisis. Her government urged Iran to immediately release the crew.
If Iran continues on this dangerous path, they must accept the price will be a larger Western military presence in the waters along their coastline, not because we wish to increase tensions, but simply because freedom of navigation is a principle which Britain and its allies will always defend.
Meanwhile, Iran and the U.S. are also at odds. 17 Iranians were reportedly arrested and charged, suspecting them of being part of a CIA-recruited spy network. But Washington has denied any involvement. Tehran said the U.S. was lying, rejecting a U.S. claim last week that it brought down an Iranian drone. Tensions in the Gulf have come to a head since the Trump administration announced the U.S. withdrawal from the 2015 nuclear deal. Iran has been facing heavy economic sanctions, while the U.S. raised its military presence in the region. In the past few months, several oil tankers in the Gulf have been attacked. Could things get worse?
Could things get worse? That's the ultimate question, isn't it? Will Gulf tensions come to a head with warships in the region? Let's loop in our panelists. With us, Tehran, Iran, Mohammad Marandi, Professor, Dean of the World Faculty Studies, University of Tehran. In London, once again, Ian Begg, Professorial Research Fellow at the European Institute of London School of Economics and Political Science. Last but not least, in Fort Lauderdale in the U.S., Ivan Eland, Senior Fellow and Director of the Center on Peace and Liberty at the Independent Institute. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. I did notice in the background we didn't have a quote from Iran, so very important. Let's have the Iranian voice being heard. Professor Marandi, what do you think is the account or recount of the Iranian side? What exactly happened? Let's hear your perspective. If you can, within 1 minute, sir. Professor Marandi.
Well, this whole escalation began with the U.S. leaving the nuclear deal and imposing its will on other countries, bullying other countries not to abide by the nuclear deal. So the EU is, as we speak, in complete violation of the nuclear deal. Over the last year, the Iranians have fulfilled their side of the bargain. They were in full compliance, but the Americans and the Europeans, as I said, were not. So I think the Iranians have felt that they've shown the international community that it is Iran that is seeking to keep the peace. It's the Americans who are seeking escalation, and it's the Europeans who, despite nice words, but they have been abiding by Trump's demands. And with regards to recent events, the United States has sent a drone over Iranian airspace. The Iranians had to shoot it down. They captured the remnants of the drone inside Iranian territorial waters. And then the British, at the bidding of the United States, according to the Spanish foreign minister, took an Iranian supertanker illegally because Iran is not a part of the EU sanctions regime. The EU sanctions regime has to do with EU countries, and the Iranians believe that the United States took this tanker as a part of their economic war against Iran.
And now we have a lot of stories going on all at the same time. Mr. Eland, coming from the U.S., just to be fair, your thought about this, particularly likely to be an escalating of tension, even leading to certain kinds of conflict, or not so?
Well, I would agree with much of what was said. However, I think it's wrong to say that the U.S. is unified in seeking escalation. I actually think that the Iranian foreign minister was right the other day when he was interviewed by Fareed Zakaria, who's a U.S. correspondent for CNN, when he said he doesn't think he takes Trump at his word that he doesn't want war, but he's not so sure about his advisors. And I would agree with that. I think we're in a dangerous situation because even if the heads of the countries don't want to escalate, sometimes the lower levels can either have a provocation, which is unauthorized, or there can be an accidental or a misunderstanding, and that's when it can escalate. And I think that's the real danger here.
Professor Beck, of course, the UK is involved. Some even say there's some kind of proxy interaction between Washington and Tehran going on in a way through the UK's actions and words. What do you make of the UK's role now? What kind of role will it play?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that the UK has found itself caught in the middle of this, because it's true, as we read the reports, that US intelligence had pinpointed the ship held in Gibraltar, the Grace 2, as being headed for Syria, and that then meant that it was in danger of breaching EU sanctions on Syria, which was not to shore up the Assad regime. So this being caught in the middle has been part of the British difficulty in this. The Iranians immediately said that they would reserve the right to retaliate, and quite clearly what's happened in the last week has been a form of retaliation, where the seizure of the Stena Empora is a quid pro quo for, or tit for tat, for what happened to the Grace in Gibraltar. Now, the UK is in this weak position where it's only got one ship in the area. That ship was on other duties and wasn't able to come to the rescue of the one that was taken by the Iranians. So it's an impossible dilemma for the Brits at the moment.
Well, Professor Morandi, let me just be a third party here in suggesting that everybody has their account of the stories itself. So let's put aside what exactly is the account of the stories, because we can go on for days and months until the conflicts are resolved. But let's focus on even bigger issues, strategic issues. Now, the Strait of Hormuz is a very important place for the rest of the world. If tensions are still rising, whichever party is playing a bigger hand in this, will be a disaster for the rest of the world. Now, Professor, from the Iranian perspective, how are you going to make sure that this will not become a retaliation against all the other parties which are not involved in this?
Well, that's a very good point. The Iranians do want shipping to pass through the Strait of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf without any difficulty, because first and foremost, Iran is very much dependent on shipping in the Persian Gulf region. So Iran's interests lie at the heart of the stability of the Persian Gulf region. And until the United States began this escalation, shipping in the Persian Gulf region was normal. I think the Iranians have so far, in response to the taking of the Iranian tanker, the reason why they took a British tanker in response is because they wanted to, first of all, prevent an escalation, because the Iranians believed that this was just the beginning, and the Americans had planned to, either through themselves or through other countries take other Iranian tankers. So the Iranians thought that they should stop this process immediately by stopping this tanker. That's my understanding of the situation. So in a sense, they did it to prevent an escalation. But in addition to that, they're very focused on one particular tanker from Britain in response to an Iranian tanker meant that Iran does not want to direct any difficulty towards other countries besides those that have been behaving antagonistically towards Iran. In fact, if you look at the region, Oman is close to Iran, Qatar is close to Iran, Kuwait is the only two countries that are showing hostility to Iran in the region are Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, and Iran has repeatedly warned these two countries to end their cooperation with the United States in this economic war, as Trump calls it.
Let me go to you, Professor Begg, also about the UK. We remember dearly the word JCPOA. Now, it is a shame that we cannot mention it anymore because it's not a reality anymore. But with the UK ever more involved in this Iranian issue in such a way over the past few weeks, would it mean that the UK have been dragged into a situation in which the JCPOA could never become a reality anymore? Despite of the fact earlier that the European countries are very much pro to still protect the so-called Iranian nuclear deal.
Well, yes, I think the UK, in common with France and Germany, would like to preserve the JPCOA. But the reality of this is that the Trump administration has been very resolutely opposed to it and is using secondary sanctions as a tool to ensure that those parties to the agreement conform to the American view rather than the Iranian view or the European view. If you were the chief executive of a big European company trading with the US and also having some small amount of trade with Iran, and the Americans said to you, you can no longer trade with the US if you continue to trade with Iran or we will sanction you, the power of the bully is very powerful there. And the reality of this is that the Europeans don't have an alternative way of dealing with this yet to go up against the American view. Iran, quite bluntly, is just too economically insignificant for the Europeans to be so concerned about.
Mr. Eland, it's not a secret that we have this kind of man-made tensions near the region of the Strait of Hormuz about the Iranian issue over decades. We heard about that decades earlier with officials coming from the Israeli Defense Ministry saying we're ready at any moment. Now, I don't want to drag into any more players in this already dramatic story, but that is one thing which I'm saying, Mr. Eland, which is drama is one thing. The real situation and the real story behind the surface is another thing. So to you, what is the real story?
Well, I think the real story did start with the U.S. abrogation of the Iran nuclear agreement, and very frankly, that was a bad move on Trump's part because the only we produce more oil now than we used to, so we don't depend on the Persian Gulf, but we're still quote unquote defending this oil. And that goes through the Strait of Hormuz, which is probably not going to be closed down for the simple reason that our Iranian colleague has mentioned, that Iran uses it too. Now, that doesn't mean that they won't try to do a tit for tat on a tanker here or there, but they have no incentive to do that. So the only strategic issue that the U.S. should have with Iran is it getting a nuclear weapon. That could threaten the United States because we don't. We need to let other people defend Persian Gulf oil. The Chinese can do it or somebody else can do it because we don't get that much oil from there. And also, we've got to cut costs. And so we really need to concentrate on the strategic reality, and that is the nuclear agreement. But of course, Trump has gone away from that to get all these other things on missiles or Iranian proxy forces to add to the agreement. And he could have built on the existing agreement But because
Yeah.
he has this thing where he wants to undo everything Obama did, that's the problem here.
Another problem, really big problem, Professor Beck. Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, likely to expire very soon, early next month. Now, Iranian nuclear issue will become a big one, even a bigger one by that time, which is only a week away. So what can we say about the latest situation? Are we facing a very different level of danger as we speak?
Well, I don't want to exaggerate it. There are dangers, but they are containable dangers. And the one thing that's intriguing about Trump is that he seems to be very, very wary of engaging in direct military action. Think of all the previous US presidents who've engaged in military action. Trump seems to shy away from that. So we can perhaps be reassured to that extent that he doesn't seem to want a conflict. Now, some of his advisors, like Bolton in the National Security Advisor role, I think are more a concern than Trump himself. So we should look beyond the nuclear deal to the broader geopolitics of what's going on. Quite clearly, the Trump administration thinks Iran is engaging in adventures in other parts of the Middle East. I'm not going to make a judgment of whether that's right or wrong, but they think that, and that's what's driving some of these pressures on the non-proliferation in other areas.
Right.
But I think that what we should concentrate on is how to de-escalate it.
How to de-escalate, that's exactly the issue, but nobody is talking about it, it seems, among the parties involved. Professor Morandi, do you think Iran can take the lead in that regard? Very briefly, you have a minute about Professor, go ahead.
Well, if it's the tanker issue, I think that the Iranians would release the British tanker if the British released the Iranian tanker. So it's quite simple. The Iranians believe that this was piracy. They have to give it up, and that would probably lead to the end of the story. With regards to the nuclear deal, Iran continues to abide by the nuclear deal. It has reduced a couple of its commitments, but by and large, it is abiding by its commitments, especially with regards to international oversea, which is Iran is still fully abiding by the deal. So despite the fact that the United States is ratcheting up tensions, despite the fact that Trump has said repeatedly or spoken repeatedly about obliterating Iran, implying some sort of nuclear attack, which is just stating that is a crime, Iran has been very restrained in its behavior towards the United States and in the region.
All right. Professor Mohammad Morandi from Iran, Professor Ian Begg from the UK, and Mr. Ivan Eland coming from the US. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for sharing your thoughts on one platform with us. I think it takes more than this conversation, but certainly this is a good one to begin with. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.